Good afternoon and welcome everyone. I'm Mark Plattner, Vice President for Research and Studies here at NED and editor of the Journal of Democracy. I'm very pleased to welcome you all here. Those of you who have attended some of our other recent events or have read recent issues of the Journal of Democracy will know that NED's International Forum for Democratic Studies has been engaged for a couple of years now in a study of the resurgence of authoritarianism and the increasing global challenges that it's posing to democracy. We began this project by focusing on what we've called the Big Five authoritarian powers: China, Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and Venezuela. Countries distinguished not only by their regional importance and size, but also by their ambitions to play a global role. We held separate roundtables on each of these regimes and then published articles on each in the January or the April issue of the journal. And then we turned our attention to some of the key international arenas in which the authoritarians have been actively engaged, learning and copying from one another, but also in many cases directly collaborating. Our focus here has been not on diplomatic or security or economic cooperation among the authoritarians, although there is cooperation in each of those spheres, but rather on the effort in international organization forms, on cyberspace, and on international election monitoring. And our most recent issue, published in October, featured essays on international media and on civil society. And today we're very fortunate to have with us two of the authors who wrote about the global assault on civil society, Anne Applebaum and Douglas Rutzen. In a sense, this has really been the core issue that generated the authoritarian effort to contain and perhaps even roll back the advance of democracy. The color revolutions, popular protests that brought down authoritarian regimes in Georgia, Ukraine, and Kyrgyzstan in 2003 to 2005, put fear in the hearts of many of the world's undemocratic rulers. And recognizing that civil society groups had played an important part in these protests, the authoritarians began searching for ways in which they could reduce the threat that such groups might pose to their own continued rule. Writing in the Journal of Democracy in April 2006, Carl Gershman and Michael Allen were among the first, along with the International Center for Nonprofit Law, to call attention to the growing efforts to restrict democracy assistance by harassing and constraining NGOs. Although they saw the problem as worrisome, at that time they argued that it could be countered by taking advantage of the desire of many authoritarian regimes to maintain their international standing, to remain members of prestigious international organizations and acceptable partners for development assistance and other forms of international cooperation. In the decades since, however, the problem has steadily worsened, with more countries imposing restrictions and many of them copying parts of one another's laws and regulations. Clearly, fear of disapproval by the international community has not been having the desired deterrent effect. I trust that our panelists will have something to say about why things have developed in this way. In just a moment, I'm going to pass the microphone to Christopher Walker, the Executive Director of our International Forum, who will moderate today's discussion. Chris, who's been the driving force behind this project, has written an essay on the authoritarian resurgence that will appear first in the January 2016 issue of the Journal of Democracy, and then as the concluding essay in an edited volume that he'll be co-editing together with Larry Diamond and me. That book, which will be entitled Authoritarianism in March, and we hope to launch it here at NED in a meeting similar to this one next spring. And now it's my great pleasure to turn the proceedings over to Chris Walker. Chris?
Thank you very much, Mark, and thanks to all of you for joining us today. We have a fantastic panel. We're doing this as a discussion, so we're going to try to keep it a free-flowing conversation with the four speakers we have. We'll open it up to questions a bit into the conversation. And I think as Mark laid out in his opening remarks.
Switch your microphone on.
Is the mic on? No. Let me do that. Right, that's probably better now.
Thanks. Thank you, Anne.
She was signaling at me.
Thank you, Melissa. Thanks to both of you. So I was saying that Mark Plattner did, I thought, a very good job of pointing out just how much has changed for civil society, not only in the last 10 years, but I think if we look at the way in which most people looked at this issue from the perspective of the mid-1990s, it's really been a dramatic change in the environment in which independent civic groups can operate without obstruction or harassment, as on the one hand, authoritarian regimes have devised extraordinarily more sophisticated means of restricting the work of these groups, both through laws and regulations, through the use of media and propaganda to delegitimize and tarnish the work of these groups, and also by creating groups that mimic the work of authentic NGOs, among a wide range of other instruments that they've developed. So I think it's an opportune time to take stock of where we find ourselves today on a number of levels. And so I'm really delighted that we have four terrific speakers. We'll take a view first from a more global level, and then we'll work our way down to some key regions and countries, and then perhaps get into some other dimensions of the problem. I'd be remiss before we start if I didn't mention the social media. You can follow us on here, and I know I would be chastised afterwards if I didn't do this. So, for those of you on Twitter, you can follow the discussion and contribute to the conversation by using the hashtag NEDEvents. And for those of you who would like to follow the National Endowment for Democracy, we're on Twitter at NEDDemocracy, and the International Forum is at Think Democracy. So I'd like to start with Doug Rutzen. Doug, in your article in the Journal of Democracy that was published in October, you kind of laid out the landscape for the challenges that civil society is facing globally. What would be the main features or the main elements of the problems and the challenges that civil society are facing, in your view?
Thanks, Chris. I want to thank the NED first for organizing this meeting, and also to thank all of you for coming. As I look out in the audience, I see so many experts and friends. I look forward to the discussion. In terms of the challenges, I think it's symbolically interesting that we're organizing this session today, because 26 years ago, we had the Velvet Revolution, November 17th, 1989. And like many people in the room, that's when many of us started to engage on issues of civic space. And at that time, civil society had a generally positive aura. You mentioned the 1990s. We had the rise of we had the rise of freedom in Central Europe. We had the fall of the apartheid regime. We had the people power movement in the late 80s in the Philippines. Lester Salmon at the time referred to it as an associational revolution. And I think it's also quite interesting that Jose Ortega y Gasset in Revolt of the Masses said that the average revolution lasts 15 years. And if you count 15 years and 5 days from the Velvet Revolution, you have people take to the streets of Kiev, Ukraine. And it was at that moment in time that we saw the autocrats take notice. We had Chavez fly to the Kremlin and meet with Putin while people were on the streets of Kiev. We see the use of legislation. We have Belarus and Zimbabwe passing restrictive laws while people are on the streets of Kiev. And since then, using Malcolm Gladwell's term, I think we've reached a tipping point. Since 2012, I've gotten the numbers as of 5 o'clock last night, there have been 141 restrictive initiatives proposed or enacted. Breaking it down slightly, 40% of the restrictions deal with the ability of people to form organizations, register organizations, or operate them. 30% of the restrictions deal with the ability to access international resources. And the remaining 30% would be restrictions on freedom of expression or the freedom of assembly. So we really are in an era where there's been a contagion of constraints.
So Doug, you've laid out this landscape where the constraints have grown, and this is the current day challenge we face. I'll turn to Anne Applebaum, who's written an incisive essay in the October issue of the journal, which looked back to the period 60 or 70 years ago, during which authoritarian and totalitarian regimes were likewise finding ways to suppress civil society. It almost seems as though it's part of their DNA. So I'm wondering if you could maybe connect the historical points of it.
Sure. Yes, absolutely. Restriction on civil society is a part of, it was a very important and central part of Bolshevik policy. And it's always been ignored because one of the things that Marx left us with is an obsession with economics. You know, even now and today in democratic societies, we tend to think that economics determines everything. And when we were watching the development of the communist regimes, first in the Soviet Union and then in the Eastern Europe, we tended to look at their forms of economic control before anything else. But actually, Lenin said that one of his sayings was that the public sphere in a socialist society should be unitary and univocal. He thought the idea of public debate was a bourgeois idea. You know, these political parties they have in the West, one has one kind of name, one has the other. They don't mean anything. These aren't deep institutions. There's nothing to protect. And actually, from the very, very beginning of the Bolshevik Revolution, from 1917, they began isolating, identifying, and picking out not just political opponents, but also people who were members of self-organized groups. Likhachov was a very famous literary critic. Dimitri Lichtsteiner was a famous literary critic who was arrested in 1928 for belonging to a philosophic society whose members addressed one another in Greek. When he went to prison, he found himself in prison in St. Petersburg with the person who had been the head of the St. Petersburg Boy Scouts. So these kinds of organizations were of interest to and of concern to the Bolsheviks from the very beginning because they saw them as somehow divisive and if not directly political, then potentially political. And one of the interesting things about Soviet society is that they maintained this obsession with civic organizations, even, as I said, even sometimes especially apolitical ones, right from the beginning to the end, even in periods of relative liberality or relative harshness. This was always a great priority. Khrushchev, Stalin, Brezhnev, it didn't really matter that the desire to keep track of spontaneous civil movements was absolutely central to their form of keeping power from the beginning. It's important to remember how many people they bequeathed this obsession. They certainly bequeathed it to the East Europeans, to their satellite states in Europe. They bequeathed it to the Chinese. And also in many parts of Africa and Asia, where people either they were directly in touch with the Soviet Union or they were simply admired Soviet methods. There was often an intuitive understanding that one of the ways you keep power and one of the ways you keep control of a sort of unitary narrative about your country is by making sure that you have in society no groups that are able to form any kind of alternate opinion or alternate civic organization and movement. And so this has really been a key part of contemporary, totalitarianism or authoritarianism from 1917, 1918 onwards. And what we see now, certainly in the case of Russia, and I know you'll want to talk about this later. I mean, Putin is somebody who was trained in the Soviet Union. He was trained in the KGB. He was brought up in Andropov's Russia. Andropov himself was particularly obsessed with democracy groups and organizations because he had been the ambassador to Budapest in 1956. So it is not an accident that he is obsessed with these kinds of institutions too, because they were part of his background, they were part of his education. That these organizations are the most, they don't look dangerous because they're talking about nice things like the environment or free speech, but they are the most dangerous of all.
So you've given this historical perspective, which in some ways, listening to your depiction of how the Soviets acted, it sounded quite similar in some ways, at least to contemporary Egypt, and perhaps some of the challenges in the Middle East and North Africa that so many of the countries, perhaps with the exception of Tunisia, are confronting today. So what do you see of the challenge in Egypt, perhaps, to start?
Well, I mean, Chris, you mentioned the reaction to the color revolutions among autocrats around the world, and certainly there's been a huge reaction in the Middle East to the 2011 uprisings and revolutions that took place. And I think the counter-revolution. So Mubarak was actually removed in mid-February 2011, and I think the counter-revolution in Egypt started taking hold in March of 2011, and we can look back at some things that the way the military ran things with controlling the amendment of the society in Egypt very early. I mean, a real attack on civil society in Egypt started in the summer of 2011, and it started first with foreign groups, and it started, as we know, with these American NGOs that were given funding by the U.S. government to do some democracy promotion programs, electoral monitoring, political party training, and so forth in Egypt for what was supposed to be a democratic opening, what the Egyptians themselves were calling a democratic opening in their first free elections in 2011. But it spread well beyond that, right? And there was this very damaging case, I think, in which all of the American NGOs who were working in this space were kicked out of the country, and people were brought to trial and so forth. And that then later to those who are accepting foreign funding. And it's all well set up in Egyptian law. Doug's organization has tracked this extensively, where there are a lot of legal restrictions on domestic funding, on collecting funding domestically, and then there are even more harsh restrictions on foreign funding. It's related to the fear of alternative power centers that might arise, whether in civil society, in the business community in Egypt, and so forth. There are a lot of different things that the Egyptian regime does to try to push back the possibility of alternative power centers emerging, and it has to do with narrative control. And that's been, they're very open about that. I mean, there are a lot of things in Egyptian law that basically criminalize, undermining national unity, and that really is meant to be the narrative that the government puts out. And there are even explicit things now in the new counterterrorism law in Egypt about you cannot contradict the official narrative coming out of the government on terrorism. So it's that's what's going on, and I think for the Middle East in particular, and perhaps other parts of the world as well, the counterterrorism imperative has really become so central here. And these governments, and especially Egypt, we are victims of global terrorism, of global jihad, and they will try to justify a lot of the things that they're doing and get support from democratic countries in the West in the name of measures that they say they're taking to combat terrorism, and of course they have a real terrorism problem. I don't want to say they don't, but many of these measures go well beyond that, and many of them are aimed at civil society and at the media.
Perhaps we can come back in a bit to this idea of narrative dominance or narrative shaping, because the security dimension is one part, but I think many of these regimes have been effective in pushing their vision kind of in an absolutist way on issues of sovereignty and what Alex Cooley, who's written for the Journal of Democracy, calls civilizational diversity. So they've been very effective in using these ideas as a way to shield and block themselves. And with that, maybe I'll turn to Louisa Greve to give us a sense of what you see as the main challenges in the China context, which also has done, despite the country's size, a fairly effective job in targeting alternative voices using many of the instruments we've already discussed.
Yes, it certainly has. The existence of groups that we might call civil society is itself a product of hard work, tenacity, and courage on the part of a very small number of individuals who said, we want to take collective civic action. You saw the beginnings of what we would call the Protect Rights movement, which was really mostly individuals in the early 90s, in the mid 90s, coming together and using the institutions that the government did want to build for development. And once that got larger, once the collective action became more organized and more connected to international civil society, then you see the crackdown coming. So in order to clean up society for the summer 2008 Olympics, the government began to use both legal and especially extra-legal means to keep these alternative voices from ruining the image of the great show that China was putting on for the world. And it's true that this post-color revolution wave has definitely affected China. A lot of Chinese official think tanks immediately were commissioned to do detailed studies. What happened here? Why are these challenging voices coming up? And so from that time forward, you see the selective use of a number of the instruments, both tightening up of the legislation and the laws. There are 3 big new laws that were announced this spring, one of which has already passed, the security law, a new law on managing foreign NGOs, and also a new counterterrorism law, which, like all of these laws, many of the laws that we're so concerned about, has vague definitions. But you don't need these laws. There are plenty of extra legal means. The suffering of the lawyers, the crackdown on lawyers, on journalists, on independent activists, on people working in environment, or any of these seemingly more innocuous topics, have been carried out through the use of the names tell you everything. Black jails. So right from the beginning, there's no pretense that those people are going to have a trial, unfair as it is. It's just people are held in black jails. And I'll give one example, if I may, that shows something that's new in China that wasn't there in the Soviet case, which is when a very interesting case just written about by one of NED's grantees, China changed the case of the spotted seals defender. So an activist living in Liaoning, actually a journalist, a businessman who started an association to protect the spotted seals that have a very limited habitat, got more organized, was named a person of the ocean by the China State Oceanic Administration for Protection of the Environment. Well, by 2014, he gets a 12-year sentence for extortion and embezzlement. And what was the difference? Well, he started to expose the violations of the law by the State Petroleum Corporation, which mobilized to say this voice needs to be shut up. So this has to do with both state interests in a state narrative, but also the economic interests of the state-owned corporations that then mobilize the instruments of the state to shut off critical voices.
So in 2015 in China, we can see the massive power of the state focusing on a spotted seals activist, which seems fairly similar to some of the groups that you were alluding to from the last century. So in some ways, I think in the globalized world, we have access to the internet in ways that people couldn't imagine 20 years ago. And I think for many people, there's this idea that it would be impossible to stop this sort of activity or groups. And yet, by use of or misuse of the law, the forms of law, use of security or distortion of it, this has become a new norm in ways. So Doug, if you had to kind of assess based on the landscape we have now, given even recent events with the tragedy in Paris and the way that governments are bound to react to that, how do you see the kind of coming landscape for safeguarding the rights of civil society? Or does that question answer itself?
It may, but I think we're in the midst of a historic contest over state-citizen relations, and that's the era in which we live fundamental norms about participation, democracy, and simply said the right to dissent are being challenged. I think that when you look at civil society, there is this campaign to try to challenge the legitimacy as well as the legality of civil society organizations with a disparate impact on groups that are engaged in advocacy. But what's interesting about this moment in time is that even service delivery organizations find space shrinking on them as well. In terms of you mentioned the counterterrorism issue and what we see happening there. I am concerned that we're going to find a renewed crackdown in the name of counterterrorism. We actually went back and studied all the justifications that governments had used to restrict civic space. And the first was counterterrorism and national security. The second was foreign interference in domestic political affairs. The third was aid effectiveness. The fourth was legitimacy and accountability. And then the unstated one, which we've all talked about, was around political power. And I think they're going to seize that narrative around counterterrorism, and we're going to see a space.
In this environment where we all thought that no voices could be contained, the internet would make us freer and smarter, that's been challenged. And I think if we look at a country like Russia, which has targeted civil society, but really used a variety of media instruments to either set the stage or to really lower the boom on leading opposition figures, civil society groups, as a way to persuade the public that these are not legitimate actors. How do you see that evolving?
You know, one of the interesting things that we've seen in the last decade has been as the media evolves, you know, in which the policies, authoritarian policies designed to counter, restrict, and control the media have also evolved. And they are actually now they're quite sophisticated now and nothing like what you think. So, for example, when the Russians want to control a story or change the interpretation of a story, they don't necessarily put out one version and say, this is the Russian state version, everybody else is wrong, because nobody would believe that anymore. So now what they do is they put out 100 versions. So the most famous example of this is when the MH17, the Malaysian plane crashed in Ukraine, and instead of offering an explanation, the Russian government, who did of course know what had happened, put out dozens of ludicrous, implausible, and ridiculous stories designed to confuse people. So what happens is the information space becomes polluted, and people no longer know what's true and what's not true, and it becomes very hard to talk about politics at all. And in this kind of, when you have fake websites and fake experts and media sources of all different kinds, it also becomes very easy to smear particular people or groups if you don't like them. And so, an organization that does, for example, Memorial in Russia, which does it does a variety of things, but one of the things it does is write history. It writes the history of the Stalinist period. Can be smeared as a foreign agent, can be smeared as anti-Russian, can be smeared as corrupt. You can, I'm not sure that's happened in the case of Memorial, but it's happened in the case of others. There can be a story in the press about how they're taking money from one person to the other, and then it becomes impossible to check and impossible to verify because the media is so weak, and one website will repeat the next website, and getting to the truth of what happened and what the organization actually does and what it stands for becomes very different. So actually the multiplication of sources, the not just newspapers, but television and websites and the internet and Twitter and so on and social media, the multiplication of sources has turned out to be rather good for authoritarians in a way that we didn't expect. We assumed that the more news is good news because then it will be impossible to control the narrative. But now they simply have developed other ways to do it. And they do it, of course, inside their own countries, and they do it abroad.
And it's fair to say that even 10 years ago, looking out towards these authoritarian examples, nobody really anticipated that it would evolve quite this way.
No, I think we anticipated that they would try to control the internet, which is, of course, what the Chinese do attempt to do in a very major way. But that there could also be techniques that wouldn't involve direct control, but that would involve simply undermining true stories and finding ways of creating alternate news or fake news. I think we didn't quite anticipate how sophisticated that could become.
So we'll take questions in a moment from the audience, but I'd like to get Michele Dunne's thoughts on how the Egyptian authorities over these recent years have used their dominance of media to put civil society on their heels or worse, given the experience since 2011.
Well, what Anne says about Russia does remind me a bit of what's going on in Egypt as well.
Not accidentally.
Right, that's right. And a lot of it is carried out through independently owned media, but independently owned by business people who are sometimes very close to the regime and competing against each other to get, for their business interests and lots of things like that, and just to be more sensationalist and so forth. Unfortunately, it is true that members of civil society, and let me focus in here particularly on the human rights organizations in Egypt, because they've been a particular victim here of demonization in the media, of being accused in many cases of being either in league with the Muslim Brotherhood or of somehow fanning terrorism and violence, undermining the economy and so forth by pointing out human rights abuses. One of the well-known activists in the Egyptian human rights themselves up during the era of Hosni Mubarak. He was pointing out to me how different it is now under President Sisi as opposed to Mubarak, let alone there was a kind of a brief era of opening, between 2011 and 2013 that promptly shut down again. He said that during the Mubarak era, the Mubarak government was always trying to sort of circumscribe human rights organizations and to keep them operating within a very limited sphere. But they actually saw some utility in their existing, right? They would point them out to foreigners. Well, we have indigenous human rights organizations. How can you say we don't allow civil society freedom? Now he feels the Sisi government wants them closed down. This is really, it's quite a different situation. But there are still some constraints or some in terms of international opinion. So, but these organizations are facing unprecedented harassment, just as there are unprecedented human rights abuses in Egypt since 2013. The human rights groups, there are forms of legal harassment. There is a level of personal harassment, of death threats, of threats to the safety of family members and so forth, of leaders in the human rights community and so forth, that is far beyond what happened under Mubarak. And there's an effort to starve them out of existence through increasing restrictions on funding and so forth. And these organizations are barely holding on. They are not operating at anything like the level that they were. They don't have the levels of staff. They can't put out their reports. They can't do the research. And this is just exactly at a time when human rights abuses are, at a magnitude that hasn't been seen in Egypt's modern history.
And so you have this environment in today's Egypt and today's Russia. And Louisa, in China, it's not unusual to see either activists or people who are singled out by the authorities on state television on the one hand, being kind of exposed and the point of focus. And at the same time, China has 640 million internet users. And I think for many observers who don't follow China closely, it's almost unimaginable that the authorities can, if not control, at least manage political speech in that. How do you see, here we are, with this sort of development of the internet infrastructure, how would you explain to someone who doesn't follow China closely the fact that the authorities can do this and kind of sideline and minimize so many voices that they choose not to engage?
Well, one thing that's very different now is that the old propaganda sounded like and looked like propaganda. So the educated slice of the population knew not to believe and learned its own form of media literacy, which is to read between the lines. And when you have great graphics, variety of sources. It's actually entertaining, and production values are higher. Then you have an illusion of a freer space. You also have a language barrier. You also have the illusion, and I'll allude to here a point at which the international community can help fight back against what seems to be the Chinese government's control in terms of certainly restricting banned words, right, using keyword searches to restrict people from jumping the firewall. You have lots of translations from foreign publications. But in the case of books, they're heavily censored and distorted. So all the famous biographies of business leaders and political leaders are published in highly redacted form. And so just last month, it's good to see that 12 big US publishers made a collective pledge to work with their authors to push back on the censorship it would require to be published in the big market. Now, we'd love to see Hollywood go along with this. We're already hearing about how Hollywood is censoring at what it does, so that in order to be shown in China, a big market, these movies will have different plot lines and show the world in a different way to conform to what the state regulators in China want. This is a kind of extra legal reach, which helps to, let's say, confirm what the Chinese government would like its own population to see because of its great market power.
Have you managed to have Iron Curtain translated into Chinese yet?
Funny enough, it is being translated into Chinese, but Gulag was translated into Chinese, my book on the Soviet concentration camps. But I think they explain it as, I was once had an invitation to speak in China about the Soviet Gulag, and the invitation came from the Institute to Fight Against Fascism. And it was because concentration camps are fascist, so it's okay to talk about them in that. Anyway, that's...
So one question from the book. You noted that one of the important mistakes the Bolsheviks made was by trying to control every aspect of society. They turned every aspect of society into a potential source of dissent. And hearing Michele describe today's Egypt, where they're really lowering the boom on alternative voices, how do you see that playing out in the contemporary context?
Well, first of all, I should say that I think both Putin and the current Chinese government have learned a lot of lessons since the 1980s. And at least until recently, I think that what they did was very deliberately designed not to encourage independent groups to use artistic or cultural or other kinds of organizations as anti-state, as forms of protest, which is what happened in Eastern Europe in the 70s and 80s. And instead you have, for example, in Russia, you want to paint whatever you want. You want to write whatever you want. You can even in Russia, at least as I said up until now, you can criticize the government as long as it's, your publication isn't very large and it stays within a small circle. And I think China is not exactly the same, but has some things in common with that they have allowed outlets to create. They simply try, as you were saying in Egypt, they simply tried to put a sort of, control over them to keep them within somehow the system, that there's a certain amount of if we do get to the stage where there are absolute bans, and if they're able to enforce those bans with violence, which is the only way they'll be able to, then we'll be in a new phase. We're not there quite yet in Russia, although it works. I mean, it can prevent people from wanting to object and from wanting to organize. And what I don't think we know yet, certainly in Russia, we don't know.
Questions, we can take them. I'd ask only that you identify yourself at the outset. Why don't we start in the back?
Hi, Fred Hyatt from the Washington Post. Thank you for this panel. I'd like to ask them if the counter-revolution started 10 years ago, to talk a little bit about whether you see any counter-revolution, any creative thinking about how to respond to this very creative and dastardly response across authoritarian regimes. In particular, given how successful the dictators have been in both legally propaganda terms, demonizing foreign connections, that foreigners like us who write or try to help these people have to think about it differently. And more broadly, do you see any emerging or any creative thinking about what the next stage could be?
So excellent questions. Would anyone like to start with those? Doug?
Thank you for that question. I think there have been some interesting responses. One, in 2010, we had the first ever UN Special Rapporteur on the freedoms of association and normal. I think, thanks to some of our colleagues at the World Movement for Democracy, are creating new norms for the new normal. And I think that's a very, very important step forward. I also think at the regional level, I see my colleague Jocelyn Neve has been working in the Latin American context, but in the African context and Latin American context, there have been the consolidation of progressive norms at the regional level. Two, the community of democracies is helping to mobilize diplomatic support. More needs to be done. But again, starting in around 2010, 2011, we've seen more governments investing diplomatic capital into the pushback. Three, assistance to civil society organizations under siege. I see Mark Legan from Freedom House, who Freedom House primes something called the Lifeline Initiative, which is providing emergency support to groups. But I also think there's been some interesting work trying to address some of the counterterrorism issues. There's something called the Financial Action Task Force. It's very clever to name something as a super technical body that no one will pay attention to and then do all sorts of policy work under that. And there's been some new work to try to engage on the counterterrorism initiatives to help ensure that they don't intentionally or unintentionally restrict civic space. But more needs to be done. I just received yesterday something from the State Department where they announced that they're going to be holding a meeting this week on financial investigations and enforcement, including criminal enforcement against nonprofit organizations for terrorist financing. And unbelievably, the meeting is going to be co-convened with the government of Bahrain and the Gulf Cooperation Council. So in Bahrain, the US government is co-convening a meeting on how to investigate and prosecute charities in the name of terrorism.
So Anne, I think, wanted to add a comment on this.
I just want to say that there is one big important change, and that is that responding to these events by going in and saying we need democracy is no longer effective. The word democracy doesn't work as well as it used to. I mean, I'm not generalizing for the whole world, and there are exceptions, and I'm sure people can point out to me reasons why this is not the case. But I think it's very important that if you want to fight this new kind of authoritarian, there are two sort of areas you need to keep in mind, and one of them is corruption. I think, Fred, you alluded to it, and you just did as well. You know, one is to focus on both from our point of view, how is our money and how is how is our money being used, in effect to repress the society via business and via other and banks and so on, and also. By far the most successful, certainly in Russia, but also I think in many other countries, the most successful pushbacks against authoritarianism have come not from sort of traditional democracy movements as we once knew them, but from anti-corruption movements. Certainly in Russia, the Alexei Navalny and those around him who've been able to find and uncover and expose the real workings of their system in a way, doing what dissidents did long ago, showing that it's fake, showing where it comes from, showing where the money is, showing how much money Putin's daughter has or where, Putin's friends live. This has made a big difference both inside, certainly in motivating some people, but also in Russia's international image. And the second thing is this, to understand the depth and importance and significance of the new disinformation, and to begin thinking. There are people who have begun to think creatively about how to fight against disinformation. Some inside, for example, in Ukraine, the most famous example is an organization called Stop Fake, which examines news stories, looks at where they've come from, looks at the photoshopped photographs and shows where the original came from, and puts them out for people to see. And this is a way of countering disinformation. And Stop Fake has now been copied in various other countries, and there are possibilities that it could be continued in other places. But finding new ways of writing about or countering or finding new ways of teaching media literacy. This is now an enormous part of fighting authoritarianism that I don't think we ever thought about in exactly that way before. This isn't just journalism training. It's teaching people how to read the media, how to understand what it is that what's being said.
And I would note that the Legatum Institute's Beyond Propaganda initiative has done some terrific reports on this, if you're not going to note it yourself, but I would commend everyone to that. Yeah, Michele?
I do. I want to endorse that very much, and there has to be a new normal or a new norm among, let's say, the chattering classes in the democratic countries. Don't appear on CCTV, don't appear on Russia Today, don't appear on Russia Direct, by legitimizing their fake media outlets that are simply set up to confuse things. And I noticed that a publication in this city that used to accept sponsorship from Russia Direct no longer does so. I hope that's come to an end. So not legitimizing their power play, the fact that these 12 publishers have publicly pledged not to cooperate with China's censorship regime, these are actually very important. I do want to also endorse what Doug said about technical bodies. So the Financial Action Task Force is a good one. Another one, of course, is Interpol, where it's long been known that the authoritarians abuse the red notice system to target those people who are outside their country, prevent them from getting visas, from traveling, and sometimes, in some cases, being able to travel after they've gotten refugee or asylum status elsewhere. Documenting campaign for a very long time to get this technical body to now checking notices. It seems that many of these technical bodies have a lot of inertia of their own. They're built upon an old assumption that all these intergovernmental organizations are based on, let's say, a post-Cold War or a Cold War norm of democratic. Anybody who joins the governmental organizations, the global organizations, is a part of a democratic norm. And we know that that's not true, so that needs to be worked on. I think even though they may seem very technical and marginal, those arenas cannot be ceded to the worst actors.
And the Interpol issue is related to another dimension of the internationalization of this civil society repression, which is the Gulf Cooperation Council, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and other such institutions now actively coordinate on a variety of levels, including the activists and
democracy and freedom versus the interests of security and counterterrorism, and these things are always in tension, and we have to balance. I think it's a good idea to get away from that argument and really to look at things practically. So in the Middle East, for example, in a country like Egypt, frankly, the authoritarian crackdown just isn't working. Hasn't delivered security, and it's very, very obvious, and there's a mountain of evidence that political repression and human rights abuses are fueling radicalization and are fueling recruits to extremist organizations. And so, sometimes just discussing it in terms of what are the results that are produced by these methods. What do we see? These methods promise security. In some cases, they promise economic prosperity, and they generally don't deliver those things. Carnegie held a conference on the Middle East a couple of weeks ago with all speakers from the Arab countries and so forth. And it was really interesting. One theme that came up over and over again is that the Middle East has enormous problems, and the governments in the region don't have the solutions to those problems. And there's a real need for different circles within those countries, civil society groups, media, business, etc., to be able to help in formulating answers to some of these compelling problems, like youth unemployment, for example, or police brutality, things that we know are driving instability in these countries. And the whole idea that I find more and more people I speak to in Arab countries, including Egypt, nodding their heads and realizing that the energies of these different circles outside of government have got to be freed up, that they've got to be legitimized within the public discussion and in consultations with the government if these countries are ever going to begin to generate their own solutions to these problems.
So I know we have a growing number of questions. I'd like to take, if we can, maybe two at a time. So here in the second row, can start right behind Mark and then come to Miriam.
Is this good? Hi, my name is Lorelei Kelly. I'm starting up a new program with the Edward M. Kennedy Institute for the Senate. It's like a presidential library, but for Congress. My program is called Resilient Democracy. And my question to you is, do you see this field of civic technology playing an increasingly important goal of sort of reducing the gap between revolutions and institutions and building legitimacy? Certainly in this country, the technology revolution and how it's impacting our institutions started in the executive branch, but it's really moving into legislatures and other kind of representative assemblies around the world. And it seems to me a very hopeful place to begin to rebuild. Have you, you mentioned the transparency and the anti-corruption. That's one very important place where this is starting. Can you think of any other that's actually connecting civil society to governance through legislatures?
Why don't we take another question while we mull that one? Okay.
Maryam Mimar-Sadeghi from Tavana. It's an e-learning institute for Iranian civil society. My question is about the free world's response to these growing trends. To what extent is the lack of pushback, the lack of leadership, and really legitimizing rhetoric about democracy, the lack of it, particularly from the United States, the Obama administration, to what extent is that fueling this resurgence of authoritarianism and cooperation between these kinds of regimes? And when I look at the Iranian example, I see that this resolute unwillingness to name any political prisoners, to ever talk about civil society, to ever talk about that there's a growing crackdown in Iran, but actually help the regime paint this picture of there's something good happening when in fact there's regression. How much is that playing into this growing trend?
So we'll let speakers respond to those two questions. Would anyone like to address Miriam's question on the lack of response from the established democracies?
Where does one begin?
I just want to raise maybe a specific case, Maryam, and it's not related to Iran, but rather to Egypt. I mentioned the NGO case that started in 2011 earlier with the American NGOs being, ending up being kicked out of Egypt and people being prosecuted and so forth, including Americans as well as Egyptians. And I think that was a case where the failure of the U.S. government to respond early and publicly created a lot of problems later on. We've all been talking about how authoritarian governments use the media to besmirch the reputations of people, and where stories start appearing in the media, and this happened with the American organizations. And there was a campaign, and it was carried out by one of the ministers in the Egyptian government, who was day and night talking about how American organizations and American funded organizations are doing illegal things in Egypt, and et cetera, et cetera. Many things that were just factually incorrect or distorted. And the US government took the approach of, well, we're not going to dignify these accusations. We're not going to reply to them. And so what happened was, by the time, a few months down the road where investigations were started, and 6 months down the road these organizations were raided, this one minister in Egypt had built up, a mountain of supposed, evidence in the public record of all the terrible things that they had done. And US officials had not just come out and corrected the record. And so, I think there are, you may be speaking in a more general sense of the need for the United States to speak up about abuses, and I agree with you on that, but there are also specific times when I think, we sometimes don't realize the damage that's going to be caused just by failing to address this perception that's being created that civil society organizations are doing terrible things or illegal things.
Well, first of all, I really didn't want to blame the United States for authoritarianism. At the end of the day, it's the Egyptian government who are the bad guys, and not. And I never like doing that. I would actually fault not just the U.S., but I would fault the West in general, not so much for not talking about democracy, but for but for a lack of creativity and a lack of awareness of what was happening as over the last decade, these different techniques have been created. The fact that we still have there's a little bit of scattered thinking and the odd, think tanks. There is still no Western response. There's no U.S. government response. The Russian government has invested $300 million in Russia today, probably more if you count social media and so on. The Chinese government is also investing hundreds of millions of dollars into its information campaigns. We were just before this panel, we were talking about all kinds of civic, sort of lower level institutional and journalistic initiatives of both Russia and China all across Europe. And there's really there hasn't even been any thinking about what the response should be. And hasn't even risen to the level of, really important debate in the public. I mean, there have been a couple of congressional hearings, but there's no coordinated or thoughtful response. There's been a sort of dismissing as, oh, we've had authoritarianism before, it went away last time, we don't have to take this issue seriously, we're a stronger society, we know that anyway, and so sooner or later everybody will see how great we are and they'll want to be like us. Well, I think authoritarianism is new, it's different, it's more energized, and I don't think they are going to see automatically that they want to be like us. And I feel there's been very, very little creativity at the top in thinking about new ways to push back.
We also had the question on how technology might be leveraged in certain cases, including in parliamentary settings. It seems to me at some level it's quite difficult in these politically authoritarian settings where the parliaments are rubber stamp parliaments or very severely sorts of innovations might be workable.
Specifically, there's this open government partnership.
I see.
Okay. For years, I've seen a tremendous amount of activity and subscribers to it, and they have pointed out very clearly the constraints on civil society, and they're taking this on internationally. And I think it's a very valuable place for civil society to go because it's a connection to the institutions themselves, and they're bringing up a lot of issues on representative assemblies. Not only that, the executive branch, transparency, it's a new way to hold a system accountable. And that seems to me like it's so true. Our own system is very hard to hold up as one that is small d democratic right now. And I think it's hopeful.
Does anybody want to add, or shall we move on? Okay. So we have a question here, and then we'll go to Mark, and then Mike. Let's take two. Yes, go ahead.
I'm Manaz Afkami, Women's Learning Partnership. We're a coalition of 20 organizations, largely in the Middle East, North Africa. And what we have witnessed really is what you're describing here. That is, just this morning we were talking with India, and they're saying that they're pulling out of the partnership because they cannot receive funds anymore. And that's unusual because the others, like Egypt or Bahrain or some of the others, have been going through this for quite a while now. And since this is an organization whose partners are part of the governance, it really is a very difficult and challenging situation. So we see this on the one hand, and then on the other hand, we see strong support, both from governments such as the Gulf governments, especially Saudi Arabia, and then also from civil society organizations who support religious extremism, radicalism, fundamentalism, and they freely move about and do whatever consciousness raising of their own kind and ideological training that goes on and on. And I don't know, it seems to us that it's time that we to try to think how to deal with these things, how to sort out governments who are friendly but at the same time are going exactly the opposite direction. What is the difference between the practices in Saudi Arabia and what ISIS actually calls forth, except maybe a little bit less violence outwardly in other countries? So we really have to sort out who we want to support, who we want to call friends, and that also national support, and making people believe we really mean what we're talking about, and we really mean the kind of lifestyle and values that we want to follow.
Thank you. And why don't we take the question from Mark Lagon?
I'm Mark Lagon with Freedom House, and thanks for, as ever, the forum's thought leadership in this area. Help me wrestle with the question. How much should we focus on youth and informal movements as opposed to formally constituted NGOs? I'm myself constructively ambivalent. I co-authored an article for, of all places, the National Interest, saying that even in the hardest cases, the people you have to work with are formally organized. I mean, if you want them to have an impact in one way or another, they're going to be formally organized. But we're going through a process of thinking of our new strategic plan at Freedom House and whether to boost an emphasis on youth and informal movements. If those NGOs are being stigmatized for being NGOs, and for their connections with funders abroad, should we be looking to youth and informal movements, or is that a mirage that we shouldn't run after as not so effective?
Okay, so we have a number of other questions, but if the speakers would like to address either of the last two on this issue.
I would just say very briefly that I would have a strategy that was very different, that was different from country to country. I mean, another mistake that we've often made in the past is thinking that you can automatically transplant ideas from formal youth movements in one place are worth supporting or not. I would simply have an open mind about what what constitutes an organization and what doesn't in different places.
I also have a point about what donors can do and also people, organizations providing political support. The key is flexibility, absolutely, from place to place and from depending on what group needs help. If there are a handful of lawyers who are willing to take on a human rights defense case, or a small group of journalists who want to start producing material, but they're not going to be able to register locally, they're only going to be available online, you think it's a small audience, finding a way to provide, let's say, small financial support to that group of lawyers or that another group that will support those activities on an activity basis as they develop themselves and see how the situation goes. So the key word should be flexibility, and we shouldn't give up on supporting Democrats just because the governments have succeeded in shutting down their ability to form NGOs or to open bank accounts.
Mark, when contrasting youth and informal movements versus more formal organizations, it seems to me you're just talking about newer versus older movements, right? Because, in a lot of countries, what were once informal youth movements eventually become organized and then they become good enough that they actually get banned. Yeah, it makes sense to be working with newer and emerging movements and groups as well as those that are already established, right? You don't want to be working only with yesterday's groups and not the ones I think are, at least some of them, will sort out into the more formalized movements and groups of 5 or 10 years from now. On the other question about how to sort out governments that are friendly but going in the opposite directions from us. One of the problems the United States is facing now in dealing with this is with governments I sometimes refer to as our frenemies, in the Middle East, is that we've got this securitization of U.S. policies. If you look back, and you can look back at individual relationships that the United States has, Egypt is a good example of this, but there are many others in which we used to have many more forms of engagement. And there used to be room for the type of thing Anne was just talking about the need for creative thinking, about other kinds of engagement. There used to be more economic engagement, but now our engagement in the Middle East, it's all about security assistance or arms sales, depending on how poor or rich the government is. There still are some other forms of engagement, but they've really shrunken down. So what it turns out is that the United States sometimes just has the wrong tool for even, and making any contribution to the resolution of a problem, right? If you've got a country that's got you've got to apply to the problem is F-16s, it's just not the right thing, and so I think this has happened over time. Our policies and our engagement has grown in some ways and shrunk in others, and we find sometimes that the tools we have to apply are a mismatch.
And Doug?
3 brief points. Mark, I think that if I recall correctly, Svulik did a study of 316 autocrats who lost power after World War II, and he found that only 10% of the autocrats actually lost power as a result of a mass movement. So as Anne said, it depends on the country context. In that 10% of the countries, it was really important, but in 90%, not so much. Point two, when we talk about youth engagement, I think we're really horrible at explaining what we do to youth, particularly the young youth. So when we think about youth, we often think about college students or people who already have their political views formed. But as my teenage daughter said, we don't do a very good job trying to communicate to kids who are 10 years old or 12 years old or 14 years old what we do. The term civil society means nothing to them. So I think there is some room to do a better job at engagement with youth. And then the final point, I like the point about India, where there are restrictions there. And I think we do have to turn the lens on democratic countries. And it's easy to focus on others, and I'm not talking about moral equivalence and so forth. But many of us have been complaining about the foreign agents in Kyrgyzstan under no, the Foreign Agents Law was first enacted here in the United States. It's the 1938 Foreign Agents Registration Act. And there was a Venezuelan lawyer who noticed that and actually imported it to Venezuela. Venezuela learned of it from the United States. And as we sit here today, Israel is now considering a new bill. As amazing as it may sound, if you're predominantly funded by a foreign government, when you appear before the Knesset or before any government official, you actually have to wear on the outside of your garment something that identifies you as being the representative of a group that's predominantly funded by a foreign government. So I think it is really important for us to be looking at countries like India, what we're doing here in the United States and other democratic countries.
So we'll have time for just a last few set of questions, but before I do that, I'd like to ask the panelists a very practical question about the impact of the current civil society crackdown, and it's triggered by something that Michele said, that essentially the authorities' approach in Egypt isn't working, and they're trying to expunge, in essence, the human rights groups within wider civil society. And something Anne Applebaum has written about in the past, it has always stuck in my mind. It's this idea of who are the alternative elites in these societies that actually have the capability and the vision to build coalitions, to shepherd the country out of decades of authoritarian or totalitarian rule. Even in the best of circumstances in Central Europe after 1989 with fantastically talented people, it was incredibly difficult. And so you think now to these environments where the regimes are going all out, essentially to extinguish these alternative elites. If you could just give some context to what the implications of this is for the development of these countries.
Well, I mean, I think that's why this is happening in part, is to prevent the emergence of an alternative elite. I mean, again, I'll return to the country I've watched most closely is Russia. And I think one of Putin's goals is just to be able to look people in the eye and say, okay, what happens after me? Is it going to be better or worse? It's going to be chaos, isn't it? And people look around and they don't see any other alternative leaders, and the ones who theoretically could be are in jail. And they say, you know what, you're right, it would be chaos. And I think that is actually the goal of, if you give people a choice between authoritarianism on the one hand and, catastrophe and civil war on the other, they choose authoritarianism. And so the idea of eliminating alternatives, alternative people, alternative ideas, alternative political systems, I think is 95% of what's happening.
And in essence, the objectives of the authoritarians are the prescription for the catastrophes that come thereafter.
Yeah, I mean they're paving the way for, if I'm gone, then the catastrophe will follow, and maybe that is what will happen. I mean.
And Doug?
There's a fascinating book by Fatali Moghadam over at Georgetown University. He talks about the psychology of dictatorship, and he focuses on precisely this point. And he said, think back to the famous Milgram experiment, where 83% of the subjects were willing to turn up the electric shock to the highest level, even after the actor had claimed that they had heart failure and so forth. And they then introduced the social support condition, where they had an alternative authority figure show up in the room and argue with the professor and say, maybe you shouldn't turn up the shock that high. And when there were competing elites in the room, compliance by the subjects dropped from 83% to, I believe, 10%. And in the Psychology of Dictatorship, Fatah Ali makes the argument that the reason that the autocrats focus on eliminating dissent is that you don't have the same level of compliance from your citizens when they see alternative visions of the future. So I think you're precisely right that a focus on the counter-elite is essential.
Okay, so we'll make this the last round of questions. Why don't we we'll start with Mike Allen. He's had his hand up for a while, and then we'll...
Thanks, Chris. Mike Allen with the NED. A lot of... Is it on? Yeah. A lot of the discussion has understandably been about autocratic regimes, offensive against civil society, but it seems that at least a few of these regimes have gone way beyond the defensive mode, and are now actively engaged in mobilizing and instrumentalizing their own civil society organizations in a way that goes beyond the usual gongos and zombie election monitors. One thinks of Russia's Nashi youth movement through to the biker gangs, Iran's utilization of the Basij against the Green Movement revolution, Saudi and other Gulf states' funding of Salafism. And apropos Anne's comments, there's a historical precedent for this, because the communists didn't only know how to repress civil society, but they also, through people like Willy Munzenberg and Otto Katz, who they sent into the West, knew how to instrumentalize and infiltrate and utilize through various popular fronts otherwise independent civil society groups, from churches and labor unions to various pliant intellectuals. So my point is this part of the new norm itself is now contested, politicized terrain?
Okay, we'll take two more. I know we have one in the back, and then we'll come to this side.
Yeah, I'm Shad Begum. I'm a women's rights activist from Pakistan, and I'm here, the Regan Faisal Fellow at NED this year. I hope you all have heard about the situation in Pakistan for the civil society, which is getting worse and tough. But I would say, we, the civil society in Pakistan, we have contributed to a lot of efforts during dealing the man-made disaster and the natural disasters. And the civil society has grown a lot in that area. So, I would just go to the question raised by the Freedom House that, okay, we should go with the new emerging informal groups. But I would say that is a kind of fulfill the agenda of that group who is actually curbing the civil society movement. So why not to work with the civil society, which is difficult right now, which is challenging right now, but I think that is not impossible, because I would say we have created our space. What right now we need, which is a gap actually, I can see that there is no such organized effort where we can just start engaging the governments, and we can start doing a dialogue with them, and the advocacy with them, and the strategies and the support should come equally, both from the national and international civil society together. And this is how, because we have seen our government always listening to the international communities about when they show concern, so they listen to them. So this way, we can create the influence, and we can again have that space, and we can operate those activities. Because for my case, I would say I have worked for 20 years now. I can't actually simply lift this work. So we need to create that space again with the dialogue and these things with the governments.
Very good. Okay, thanks. And let's take one more question. If there's none over there, we'll come over here. We'll take this. Yeah.
Yes, I'm Robert Dubek with American Friends of the Czech Republic. My question goes to the playing field. Ms. Greve has referred to the opinion of the chattering classes, but I guess the question is, are we talking about penetrating the opinion of these authoritarian societies, penetrating, and what is the vehicle to input?
And then we'll let the panelists finish up. If you can keep it brief, sir.
Yeah, thank you. My name is Hermes Levy. I'm an activist advocating for the option. My question is about you think society can.
Very much. So we have a number of questions in how we kind of battle the new normal in the information space. And do you want to offer thoughts to start?
Yeah, I wanted to answer the question about sort of what we used to call fake civil society or Gongo's government. What was Gongo's sort of government
Organized.
government organized,
NGOs.
non-independent organized, whatever. You know, again, the past is a precedent. You know, the Soviet Union used to fund communist. In funding the communist parties, they very often found people. You know, those communist parties, whether depending on the country, were often not fake. They were real communist parties with real communists in them who really wanted real revolution. So maybe not so much in this country, but certainly in many European countries. And I think some of the methods that are being used now are sophisticated in new ways that we haven't really thought about yet. So again, you know, I know that China does this in its sphere of interest. Again, Russia and Europe doesn't invent its supporters. It simply marshals them or funds them or finds them in the form of Marine Le Pen, for example, the head of the National Front. And so he funds the National Front, which then becomes, in effect, a pro-Russian organization working in France, which has, I wouldn't say 100% chance of having a presidential victor, but it's looking less unlikely than it used to be. You know, they also are looking for, they create civic organizations in new ways. So, for example, to get fighters to fight in eastern Ukraine, the Russians had a national recruitment campaign, and they put up signs in places, and you could sign up and you could go join. So, in other words, they're looking to use the discontent or the anger in their own society and to send it in a certain direction. So the sophistication and thought that now goes into doing this is, I think, beyond what we expect. We have an idea that these are all going to be fake organizations, you know, that everybody will laugh at. Well, they aren't. They're real, very, very often. And in that sense, I think this is. I didn't like this expression, the new normal, because I'm not sure there was an old normal, really. But you know, in that sense, I think these are very stable tactics. In that case, I would say, you know, these are not methods that will be easy to overturn or easy to show as false, because they aren't false. They're real.
And the other part of the equation, which was implicit, is the investment that these states are putting into these things today.
Huge investments into organizations, funding, friends, business contacts, think tanks, real think tanks.
Final thoughts? Yep.
Yeah, on this question, I agree. You know, in the Middle East and the Arab countries, I mean, you have these fake organizations, Michael, but you also have real organizations, real civil society organizations that have been forced into the couple of different polarization narratives, right, that are going on in the Middle East right now. You have the Islamist versus non-Islamist polarization narrative that you have in a country like Egypt and others, and then you have the Sunni versus Shi'i, you know, Muslim polarization narrative that's more in the eastern part of the region. And so what you find is, you know, organizations that maybe are real, but they've somehow been forced to choose sides, you know, and sometimes they choose a side based on identity or whatever, and they find themselves on the same side as an authoritarian government or whatever. And what I find encouraging is that I don't find that this is vigorous or durable. You know, that a lot of the organizations that are truly fake tend to evaporate, you know, in the Middle East fairly quickly. Those that are real and but have been somehow we're sort of, so to speak, pro-freedom organizations and suddenly find themselves on the same side with an authoritarian government. Often I find they end up either completely losing their credibility and withering or changing sides again, you know, and we've seen that happening, you know, in a number of countries where they just kind of can't sustain that. I mean, I guess my last thought is, you know, as much, Anne, as you've been talking about how creative authoritarian governments can be and moving forward and so forth, at least in the Middle East region, I still see younger people. We've got this tremendous demographic youth bulge in the region, and that those young people are more creative and are moving out faster. I mean, right now they're kind of on the back foot, right? I mean, governments have managed to kind of re-erect the wall of fear between the government and society in many countries because of what's going on, you know, in the region. But I'm always still amazed at the things I see, you know, the information or social media campaigns in which young people are, rejecting a lot of what's going on, and often with a great deal of humor and creativity.
And Doug, last comment?
Well, I might take the conversation just in a slightly different direction, which is the title is The Global Assault on Civil Society. It's important to talk about that. But C. Wright Mills had a great expression. He said, every revolution has a counter-revolution. That's the way you know the revolution was real. And I would like to circle back to where we began, which is that there is new vibrancy to civil society, and the story is not entirely negative. Just look at the people in this room and our partners who are achieving great things in a number of different countries. And there are positive developments. So I don't want us to leave the meeting thinking that the storyline is entirely negative. More needs to be done to address that. But whether we talk about the work done by the United Nations, by the World Movement, the NED, USAID, and others, we are finding that the work of our partners is being supported. There are good things to say, and we should have some optimism as we leave as well.
Very good. And Louisa?
Right. And I'll say that although Democrats may be a minority, a shrinking minority, a minority under siege, it doesn't mean that they aren't there. And so it may be all the more challenging to find ways for others to support them, to let them have solidarity, for their voices to come out. There's no need for outsiders to input democratic messages or alternative views of social development or history into these countries. The key really should be to enable even a very small minority in those countries to raise their voices and persuade their fellow youth, their fellow co-religionists, other people in their society. And so that should be the challenge, even if when it's the smaller the group, in fact, the more we should be careful, but carefully support their ability to, in fact, amplify their voices and again grow their movements over time.
I'm very glad we ended on a positive note, and it's absolutely the case that there are so many courageous people fighting for their democratic rights around the world. And I think if we've learned anything, that democracies can't become too complacent and cavalier about the degree to which they express democratic solidarity. And I think this is one of the threads that runs through all of these discussions, and in some ways has been limiting the established democracies from providing the sort of support they should. But I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the speakers who touched on so many diverse subjects within this wider subject of the crackdown on civil society. So please join me in thanking them for their